The attempt on the 45th aroused a variety of reaction from people across the internet. In the following hours, there was general confusion and speculation which everyone was eager to deliver their unique takes on. As expected, we saw boring calls for unity and functional schizophrenics describing their theories on how it could have been staged. Then there was a perhaps equally expected but all the more humorous reaction from those expressing grief that they hadn't seen Trump, well... Of those caught in this wave were many self-described Marxists. As funny as this sentiment may be, it is important to remember the Marxist position on terrorism. The experience of the revolutionary movement has proven it to be ineffective. It has repeatedly stood in the way of revolutionaries by serving as a tool of reaction. The act requires a disconnection from the masses, which means it can never radically change society. Instead, it more often gives the state an excuse to increase autocracy, which serves as a threat to the very movement it hoped to inspire. We must not allow ourselves to be in awe of terror's melodramatic displays, lest we be fooled into viewing it as an adequate means of action. Terrorism's ineffectiveness as a political tool is something which Marx and Engels had first-hand experience with. In the 1840s through 60s, Marx advocated for Fenianism, an Irish independence movement on the basis of class struggle. He believed an independent Ireland would weaken English landlords, something he viewed as necessary for the emancipation of the British proletariat. He was quite optimistic too, saying that he viewed Irish liberation as inevitable, something he had once regarded as an impossibility. Sadly, the methods of the Fenians obstructed these efforts, providing a source of endless frustration to Marx. The Fenians, being the proud Irish they were, utilized terrorism and rash acts without a greater plan for their struggle against their occupiers and oppressors. This ultimately resulted in a major player in the First International, the Reform League, condemning the Fenians. Their condemnation coincided with a major attack, the Clerkenwell explosion, which was carried out by the Irish Republican Brotherhood and killed 12 people in an attempt to free one of their own. In a letter to Marx, Engels said of the attack,
"The Clerkenwell folly was obviously the work of a few special fanatics. It is the misfortune of all conspiracies that they lead to such acts of folly because we really must do something. We really must get up to something. Especially in America, there has been a lot of bluster amongst this explosive and incendiary fraternity. And then along comes some individual jackasses and instigate this kind of nonsense."
He believed that acts of this kind scared the English workers, who were otherwise sympathetic towards the Irish cause, into supporting occupation. Marx couldn't blame them, saying,
"One cannot expect the London proletarians to allow themselves to be blown up in honor of the Fenian emissaries."
They nonetheless continued to fight for Irish independence in spite of pig-headed mistakes. Russia was the one instance where Marx saw value in terrorist activity. He praised the Narodniks, who had turned to it after failing to incite the peasants to revolt. They believed terror could encourage the population to reject the Tsardom and establish a higher form of society on the communal grounds of semi-feudal Russia. Marx described this group as consisting of excellent people through and through, who were simple, straightforward, and heroic. His perspective on this matter is not the deviation it may seem, as it did not rely on the effectiveness of these acts. Russian society was correctly observed to be on the brink of revolution, the time frame of which, as we have seen, was just longer than what was predicted. In what was an obviously unstable situation, terrorism could not undo already odious economic conditions. If anything, it could serve as a source of further state destabilization. The Narodniks' tactics and theory of development were eventually analyzed by none other than Lenin himself. He commended their organizational methods but saw it as a substitute for popular self-activity, which it clearly was after it had failed to organize the peasantry. This inherently led to its disconnection from the masses, which are essential for the transformation of society. Their isolated nature would make it easy for the Tsarist government to crack down on their organization. Their leaders ultimately lost faith in the methods as a result, as they did with peasant organization. They could not take the shortcut to revolution, they had to make one with the masses. Despite the Narodnik approach resulting in failure, new groups in the early 1900s, such as the so-called socialist revolutionaries, would adopt the method. This new wave insisted it was immune to Lenin's criticism by only believing in terrorism, which was carried out alongside work with the masses, and therefore was not a distraction from organizing. However, Lenin had observed that the very way their approach was carried out was inherently disconnected from this struggle, and even stemmed from disillusionment from it. The doctrine of these SRs revealed a lack of interest in leading a revolutionary class, which in doing so delegitimizes their revolutionary title. They claimed not to want to divert attention away from mass action, but that the rise of the workers was still a long way off, and so the act of terrorism could tip the scales in the favor of the people. Is this not a direct substitute for mass action? It not only serves in place of it, but also directly takes away from it. Lenin described this best in his work Revolutionary Adventurism, saying the terrorist act has the immediate effect of simply creating a short-lived sensation, while indirectly it even leads to apathy and passive waiting for the next bout. The terrorist clearly places too much faith in the power of the individual. It has never yielded the desired result of inspiration, because to do so would require organization, something which disconnected individuals are incapable of achieving.
Time and time again, historical instances such as the attempted assassination of the high-ranking Bolshevik Nikolai Bukharin in 1919 demonstrate this to be true. Bukharin, who was often worried about the political oppression of non-Bolshevik political groups, was speaking at a meeting in Moscow about this topic when a group of anarchists and left socialist revolutionaries threw a bomb into the building the conference was being held in, killing 12 of the 100 to 120 people in attendance, injuring 55, including Bukharin. This event was referenced by the anarchist Emma Goldman, who complained that the Bolsheviks lumped all anarchists in with their, quote, evil spirits to whom the revolution meant only destruction, who committed this attack. At several mass rallies held 3 days after the bombing, workers and soldiers held posters with slogans such as, "Your martyrdom is a call for reprisals against counter-revolutionaries," and "We accept your challenge, long live the merciless Red Terror." As a result of the bombing, the Bolsheviks replied with reprisals on all anarchists, regardless of their thoughts on the attack. And as for the group that organized the bombing, the tiny, all-Russian insurgent committee of revolutionary partisans, more than half of them were executed or committed suicide. Let's take a look at a more contentious example, the burning of the Reichstag, which most mainstream historians agree was committed by young Dutch council communist Marinus van der Lubbe. In an attempt to rally German workers against the Nazis, he set fire to the Reichstag a few days before a parliamentary election. The fire and its subsequent trial were widely publicized and gave the state a cover for its naturally accelerating alienation from society. Just a day after the burning, Hindenburg signed the Reichstag Decree, which suspended various freedoms and allowed the state to arrest anyone they wanted without legal reason. The election following it led to the signing of the Enabling Act, which allowed Hitler's government to pass laws without the approval of the Reichstag. This was easily passed with support from the centrists and conservatives in the Reichstag, with little opposition following mass KPD arrests justified by the fire. Some people make the argument that this was staged. However, this is just further confirmation of terrorism's ineffectiveness. Its isolated nature makes it easy for governments to stage false flags, all the more reason we must avoid it. While currently the American state has no need for the mass political roundups of Nazi Germany, one day a crisis will necessitate it. In the meantime, the state will lay the necessary foundation by removing rights it had once deemed safe to give. It is entirely possible that a future assassination attempt, whether it was committed by communists or simply blamed on them, will play into the state's justification for this inevitability.
Our condemnation of terrorism should not be understood as some condemnation for violence. Every revolution which has brought the oppressed classes into dominance has been achieved through its means. We lament its waste in the impatient hands of the terrorist who we have so clearly seen knows not how to utilize it. Only an organized revolutionary class can effectively employ violence for its emancipation. Lenin put it best when he said,
"Without in the least denying violence and terrorism in principle, we demanded work for the preparation of such forms of violence as were calculated to bring about the direct participation of the masses and which guaranteed that participation."
Further, terrorism, for all its inconveniences, is a natural occurrence in the struggle of the oppressed, one which we clearly have not been able to drop. Marx described it as a historically inevitable means of action. Although they highly criticized its effectiveness, they never found themselves outright condemning it and its perpetrators. It's only through looking back at our history with terrorism that we clearly see how pointless it is. Marx and Engels experienced firsthand its obstructive nature when advocating for a free Ireland. They felt it viable in Russia because the state would imminently collapse, something already set in motion without or despite terrorist activity. Lenin would later witness this possible exception to the rule play out and fail, viewing its isolation as the cause of its downfall. He viewed terrorism as hyper-individualistic, something which meant it could have no real effect on mass movements. While the terrorist hopes to inspire the masses, organization has proven to be the only effective way of doing this. Most importantly, all of these great thinkers regarded terrorist logic as stupid, finding it to exhibit glaring contradictions upon simple examination. Understanding the inability of terrorism to inspire anything beyond other acts of terror, we as Marxists should abstain from praising its use and instead seek to understand how it only makes us a target, how it only works to hinder the workers' cause.